My name is Bagas Aji Saputra, and I will make a video about Cuba, especially in the economic sector, to fulfill my midterms exams. The impact of the economic embargo. Cuba struggled for economic stability. Cuba has faced various economic challenges for decades. One of the main factors is the economic embargo imposed by the United States since the 1960s. This embargo has hindered international trade and Cuba access to the global market. Additionally, Cuba has experienced internal issues such as a lack of economic diversification, inefficient foreign investment, slow bureaucracy, and inefficient economic policies. Cuba recorded an average inflation rate of 70% in 2021. With a minimal government reserve, Cuba has had to drastically reduce imports. The record number of Cubans fleeing the country indicates the worst socio-economic crisis since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Severe shortage of food and medicine are daily reality in a country that has been ravaged by the U.S. trade embargo since 1962 and tight government controls since 1959. Regular power outages have reminded Cubans of the early 1990s when the Soviet subsidies ended after the USSR collapsed, leaving the island struggling. The number of Cubans seeking entry into the U.S., mostly at the Mexico border, surged from 39,000 in 2021 to over 224,000 in 2022. Many have sold their homes at low price to buy one-way flights to Nicaragua and travel through Mexico to the U.S. After 6 decades of trade blockade and rigid social models, plummeting living standards have caused 2% of Cuba's population to leave the island in just 1 year. The Cuban economic crisis, defined by extreme inflation, shrinking GDP, accumulation of social debt, surge of goods, high foreign dependency, and weak economic growth, raised many questions about the island's economic development and its overall future. What, who, when, where, why, and how? Point number 1. What? The economic crisis in Cuba refers to the situation where the country is facing difficulties in meeting the basic economic needs of the population and experiencing deterioration in key sectors such as agriculture, industry, and infrastructure. Point number 2. Who? This issue affects the entire Cuban society, including ordinary citizens, workers, and the business sector. Point number 3. When? This issue has been ongoing for several decades, but escalation occurred during specific periods, depending on factors such as government policies and geopolitical situation. Point number 4. Where? This economic crisis is happening across the territory of the Cuba, including urban and rural areas. Point number 5. Why? Several factors have contributed to the economic crisis in Cuba, including the economic embargo from the U.S., inefficient economic policy, and lack of economic diversification, and other internal issues. The last point, how? This economic crisis affects Cuba through declining production, high inflation, lack of goods supply, high unemployment rates, and difficulties in meeting basic needs such as food, house, and public service. Significance of the issue to international relations discussion. The issues of the economic crisis in Cuba has several significance to discussion on international relations. First, the economic embargo imposed by the United States and its impact on Cuba become a focal point in the bilateral relation between the two countries. This issue reflects the challenge in economic diplomacy and nation building amid tense relations between Cuba and the United States. Second, the economic crisis in Cuba also highlights the importance of international cooperation and economic assistance in helping countries experiencing economic difficulties. This issue can trigger discussion about the role of international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in providing financial and technical support to countries in need. Furthermore, the economic crisis in Cuba can also have implications for the country's political and social stability. Economic dissatisfaction and difficulties in meeting basic needs can lead to social tension and the potential for unrest. The highlights of the importance of economic stability in maintaining peace and security in the context of international relations. My thoughts on the issue. The economic crisis in Cuba is a complex issue with underlying problems involving both internal and external factors. The long-standing economic embargo has had a significant impact on Cuba's economy and the daily lives of its people. Economic diversification and effective policy reforms are crucial steps in addressing this crisis. The importance of international cooperation in assisting Cuba and other countries facing economic difficulties should not be overlooked. Financial assistance, fair trade, and technology transfer can play a role in promoting economic growth and sustainable development. Furthermore, the economic crisis in Cuba serves as a reminder of the importance of examining the impact of economic policy on people's lives. Efforts should be made to improve efficiency, promote sustainable private sectors, and strengthen infrastructure and investment to drive inclusive economic growth. This crisis in Cuba also reminds us that economic resilience is a crucial aspect of a country's stability. Efforts should be made to reduce reliance on a single sector, increase economic diversification, and encourage innovation and entrepreneurship as drivers of economic growth. Overall, the economic crisis in Cuba is a complex issue that requires a holistic approach to find long-term solutions. International support policy reforms and efforts to enhance economic resilience are key to addressing this challenge and achieving sustainable development in Cuba.